I'm not a traditional person typically, but I do love tradition. And I don't know how you grew up. I grew up going to church, very traditional church. And it wasn't Easter Sunday until the pastor got up. We didn't call him the pastor, he was a minister. Or in some churches I went to, a preacher. And so he got up in the pulpit and he would say, "He is risen." And the congregation would say, "You guys went to the same church I did. I love that. All right. Well, so let's try it together. If you're new to church, maybe you don't know that little tradition. I'll say "He is risen," and then you say "He is risen indeed." So let's try it together, all right? He is risen. He is risen indeed. You guys are good. All right. All right, now it's Easter. All right, it's grateful to be here. Well, one of the reasons why this Sunday is so important, it's not just important because we're going to do an Easter egg hunt with the kids later on this afternoon, or maybe you have a ham in the oven right now that you're baking, or you're going to join us for lunch afterwards here, or you get dressed up and there's a photo booth. All of those things are important, but the reason why Easter is so important is because if Easter did not happen, if what we're going to look at today in one of the Gospels did not happen, then none of this is really relevant. No, you don't have to pray anymore. You don't have to sing anymore. You don't have to give anymore. You don't have to come to church anymore. If what we're going to talk about today did not happen historically, then none of this matters. This is all just religious exercise. This is all just something that we do to make our lives better or to make us feel better about ourselves, because if the resurrection didn't happen, then nothing really matters inside of Christianity. And so what we're going to talk about today is not just important, it's the linchpin of our faith. And Paul even says that in the New Testament. Paul says, hey, if the resurrection of Christ did not occur, then everything else is in vain. And so this day is super important, not just because we celebrate Jesus rising from the dead, it's because if it didn't happen, then nothing else matters. One of the things I've feared most of my life, as far as back as I can remember, I feared failure. Not just failure as far as failing, but actually being perceived by others as a failure. Now, the problem with that is I'm really good at it. Like, I'm really good at failing. And so, when I was a sophomore in high school, I got my first job. I had a paper route, and I had I'd mow yards, but I got my first W-2 job, and I was a waiter at Noble Romans in Crawfordsville, Indiana. And so I do this 2-week training period, and then I get on my own on a Friday night, and my first customers are 4 state cops, and they order 2 pitchers of Diet Coke, and I proceeded to spill it all over them. And on my first day. And so then I got, kind of demoted at that point to dish man. And so I started washing dishes after that. The next summer, I was working at Target as a cashier. A lady comes through my line, no indication at all that she's with child, but I was trying to make small talk. And so I just said, "So when's your baby due?" And she proceeded to say, "I'm not pregnant." And so I flipped my line on and went on break. And I don't think I ever went back to Target at that point. Just really good at failure. When I was a sophomore in college, I was on a team at my Bible college that was called the Student Ambassador Team. And our job was to make the school look good and to make people feel welcome. We had these events throughout the year called Fall Campus Challenge and Spring Campus Challenge. And the Fall Campus Challenge would be a Friday night, Saturday event where high school students would come onto the campus. We would host them in our rooms, and then we'd have a huge Christian concert on a Friday night. They would go to classes during the day on Friday, and then we would try to recruit them to go to the school on Saturday, and had these events on Saturday. And so my job as a student ambassador was to make the youth groups and the kids that came on campus feel welcome and make the school look good. And so I organized an open gym for all of the kids who wanted to play basketball. And so we had, all of these games running in our gym. And I happened to get on a team that we were just running the court. We were like Michigan last night, all right? We're just dominating, all right? And so we're getting ready to get to the end of the evening, or the end of the open gym, but our team was doing so well. And that night, there was a Christian band in concert called For Him. And you have to be old to know who For Him is. And so For Him was going to do this concert. And if you've never heard of them, it's okay. I hadn't either. And so we're playing, and a couple of the guys after this last game goes, we got to go get ready for the concert. And I said, dude, we have a great run going here. You don't need to go to the concert. He's like, no, I need to go get ready. I need to get ready for the concert. I said, dude, it's for him. Nobody wants to go to that concert. And he and the other guy look at me and say, we are in for him. They were 2 of the 4 people in for him. So failure, I'm really, really, really good at it. So this message may be another example, all right? 25 minutes from now, you may look back and go, oh, that was just another example of him failing because this message may bomb, all right? But here's why I share that with you. Because until Sunday morning, the Easter story was surrounded by failure. It was really all about failure. I mean, Jesus had claimed to be a conquering king. He was going to come and usher in a new kingdom, and now he lay in a manger. He lay in a tomb, and the disciples have all scattered. Right? You have these disciples who have pledged their allegiance to Jesus. They've left everything to follow Jesus, and then when Jesus needed them the most, they fell asleep in the garden. When he asked them to pray, they couldn't even stay awake. And Peter, who said he would die for Jesus, denies him 3 times. And in a moment of courage and impulsion, he takes a sword out and slices off a soldier's ear. You have all of these people who claim to failure. You have all of these people in the Easter story, and after 3 years of Jesus' ministry, they don't feel like it was a success. It was a complete failure. Like everything that they had given their life to, everything that they had pledged to, everything that they had thought was going to come true is now not in existence. The whole thing was a failure until Easter morning. Until the resurrection, everything failed. And then everything changed. And so the story that we're going to look at today, or the account of the resurrection we're going to look at today, is in all 4 Gospels. It's in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We're going to look at Luke's account of the resurrection. We're going to read Luke 24, verses 1 through 12, and then we're going to skip down and read 35 through 43. And if you don't have a Bible, you can follow along on the screen. It says, but very early on Sunday morning, the women went to the tomb, taking the spices they had prepared. They found that the stone had been rolled away from the entrance, and so they went in, but they didn't find the body of the Lord Jesus. As they stood there puzzled, two men suddenly appeared to them, clothed in dazzling robes. The women were terrified and bowed their faces to the ground. Then the men asked, why are you looking among the dead for someone who is alive? He isn't here. He has risen from the dead. Remember what he told you back in Galilee, that the Son of Man must be betrayed into the hands of sinful men and crucified, that he would rise again on the 3rd day? Then they remembered that he had said this, and so they rushed back from the tomb to tell the 11 disciples and everyone else what had happened. It was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and several other women who told the apostles what had happened. But the story sounded like nonsense to the men, so they didn't believe it. However, Peter jumped up and ran to the tomb to look. Stooping, he peered in and saw the empty linen wrappings. Then he went home again, wondering what had happened. Skipping down to verse 35. Then the 2 men from Emmaus told their story of how Jesus had appeared to them as they were walking along the road, and how they had recognized him as he was breaking the bread. And just as they were telling about it, Jesus himself suddenly standing there among them. Peace be with you, he said. But the whole group was startled and frightened, thinking they were seeing a ghost. Why are you frightened, he asked. Why are your hearts filled with doubt? Look at my hands, look at my feet. You can see that it's really me. Touch me and make sure that I'm not a ghost, because ghosts don't have bodies, as you see that I do. As he spoke, he showed them his hands and his feet. Still, they stood there in disbelief, filled with joy and wonder. Then he asked them, do you have anything here to eat? They gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he ate it as they watched. Apparently, resurrections make you hungry, all right? And so Jesus just wanted a snack. And can you just imagine, I just picture, can you guys have anything to eat? They give him some fish, and they're all just like standing there just watching him eat this fish, like just completely stunned. But here's what I want you to see from this text, and I love the authenticity of this text. That's why I wanted to speak to you from it today. Because Jesus' followers were not expecting the resurrection. The disciples were not standing outside the tomb on Sunday morning going, 10, 9, 8, 7, right? They weren't counting down to the resurrection. They had no clue that the resurrection was going to happen. Not only were they not expecting the resurrection, no one was really expecting the crucifixion. This was not the first time that the Romans or the Jewish leaders tried to kill Jesus. Repeatedly throughout Jesus' ministry, they tried to stone him. They tried to run him out of town. They tried to kill him. Jesus knew that they were plotting against him from really the very beginning of his public ministry, and so he had always escaped. And so verse 1 of Luke 24 says, "But very early on Sunday morning, the women went to the tomb, taking the spices they had prepared." Why were they taking spices? Because on Friday night, they did not come to the crucifixion prepared to see Jesus' dead body. In fact, they were so unprepared that Joseph of Arimathea had to go to Pilate to request the body to actually allow Jesus to be buried in a borrowed tomb. So they had not made preparations for Jesus' burial physically. They didn't know where they were going to lay him. So they had to borrow a tomb to place his body there. And so the women were not able, embalming process was not like it is today 2,000 years ago. And so they were going to bring spices to help with the stench of the decaying body, as well as just to bring honor to the person that they viewed as Lord and Savior. And so they bring the spices to the tomb. Why? Because they expect a body to be there. Right? There is no anticipation of the resurrection. Because until Jesus, dead people stayed dead. Right? And Easter is just this reminder that with Jesus, anything is possible. Like you may have a dream that has died in your life, but with God, it can be resurrected. You may have a job that feels hopeless, or a diagnosis that feels hopeless, or a situation that feels hopeless, but with Jesus, there is always hope. You may have a relationship in your life that is broken and you think it's beyond restoration, but with Jesus, anything is possible. Because until the resurrection of Christ, dead people typically stayed dead. And so what I want to give you today in the time that we have left, I want to give you 4 things that Easter makes possible. 4 things in your life and my life that we see in this text that Easter makes possible. And the first is this: because of Easter, we can know our failures aren't final. Because of Easter, we can know that our failures aren't final. Mass confession time, okay? I think confession's good for the soul. So I thought we could just all come clean this Easter. So wait until the end before you raise your hand, because some of you are going to raise your hand multiple times, okay? And I don't want you to feel embarrassed. But if you've ever failed at something, if you've ever missed the mark on anything, if you ever done something that you wish you hadn't, if you ever said something to someone that you wish you didn't say, if you've ever inappropriately lost your cool with a 2-year-old, if you've ever failed in any way, morally, athletically, academically, relationally, vocationally, or spiritually, just raise your hand. If you've ever lied in church, raise your hand. Some of you did not raise your hand. Now you need to raise your hand because you lied. All right, there you go. Good. Okay. I think we're all in the same place, right? We've all failed in some way. You failed in a relationship. You failed as an employee. You failed as a sibling. You failed as a parent. We've all failed in some way. And Peter has failed in a major way. Peter's been one of the most visible disciples of all 12 disciples. He's written about more throughout the Gospels than any other disciple. And look at verse 12 of Luke 24. It says, Peter jumped up and he ran to the tomb to look. And I think what prompted Peter to jump up more than the other disciples did not believe what the women were saying, but Peter, there was something in him that felt like something could be redeemed. Because Peter is carrying regret back to the tomb. He's carrying regret of broken promises. For those of you that are familiar with the story of Peter, you know that the day before the crucifixion, Jesus begins to tell people that he's going to be betrayed. He's going to be handed over to, the Jewish leaders and to the Romans to be crucified. And Peter says, no, that's never going to happen. I'll die before I let you die. And then Jesus says, no, Peter, you don't understand. Not only are you not going to die before I die, you're going to deny that you even know me. And Peter says, no, Lord, that's not going to happen. And then we all know the story of what happens, right? Peter denies that he knows Christ. And so he jumps up to go to the tomb. And if you go back 2 chapters before Jesus is arrested in Luke 22, it says this, then seizing him, they led him away and took him to the house of the high priest. And then look at this last statement. And Peter followed from a distance. So even before the denial, there was distance between Peter and Jesus. Peter had distanced himself physically from the person of Jesus and from everything that was going on. And as I look back at moments in my life, the biggest regrets that I have in my life are when there are distance between me and Jesus. When I have either purposely or through atrophy allowed distance to become between me and the person of Jesus. And so Jesus is led away and Peter follows from a distance. You see, regret lives in the distance between me and Jesus. But it wasn't just Peter that failed that night. Look at Matthew chapter 26, verse 56. It says, then all of the disciples deserted him and fled. See, all of the disciples are living with regret. Out of all of our emotions, failure is something that sometimes we can't avoid, but regret has a deeper sting, right? Psychologists say that the most powerful emotion that we feel and the most common emotion that we feel is love, but the second most common emotion that we feel is not hate, it's not anger. The second most common emotion that we feel is regret. And the sting of regret goes deep because regret says, I know things could have been different if I would have done something differently. And if you think about the regrets that you carry into this place today, or maybe those of you that are watching online, the regrets that you carry into relationships or even your relationship with God, there's probably a feeling that you look back on a bankruptcy, or you look back on a broken relationship, or you look back on getting fired from a job and you think, man, if I would have just done that differently, my marriage wouldn't have ended. If I would have just done that differently, that relationship would have been restored. If I would have just done that differently, I would have a better relationship with my adult kids. Like, we all carry these regrets. And here's the beautiful thing about Easter. The death of Jesus covered your sin. The resurrection of Jesus overcomes your regrets. Right? Because what we're going to see through the resurrection is that everything is restored. We don't have time to look at it today, but there is a time where Jesus, the resurrected Jesus, meets with Peter. And the restoration of their relationship, the 3 times that Jesus says, do you love me? And Peter says, I love you. They overcome the regret of the denials that Peter had of Jesus. So because of Easter, you can be confident that your failure isn't final. Next, because of Easter, we can be honest about our doubts and disbelief. We can be honest about our doubts and disbelief. Look at verse 41 of Luke 24. It says, still, they stood there in disbelief, filled with joy and wonder. I love this so much because we tend to sanitize the Easter story, and Jesus, was dead and buried, and he was crucified and buried, and then he rose 3 days later, and praise God, and we just kind of, do the golf clap and we just kind of tie a bow on the story of Easter, but there is an emotional roller coaster going on with the disciples. When the women come back from the tomb and they start saying that a body was not there, that Jesus had rose from the dead, and that an angel had appeared to them, I love the collision of all of these emotions. They stood there in disbelief, and then joy, and then wonder. There's this disbelief. There's no way this could be true. There's no way Jesus could have risen from the dead. Then there's joy. Oh my gosh, he's alive. What if this is possible? And then there's wonder. Oh my gosh, he's that powerful. He's that awesome. There's this uncontainable joy, and then there's this undeniable disbelief that kind of trickles through all of the disciples, and it hits them all at different times. Verse 11 of Luke 24 says, but the story sounded like nonsense to the men, so they didn't believe it. And maybe that's where some of you are today. Maybe this is your first time in church since last Easter. Or maybe this is your first time in church since your spouse walked out. Or maybe this is your first time in church